My name is Yusuf Halabi, and on October 19, 2018, I crossed over the line between life and death. What happened on the other side changed everything I thought I knew, not only about myself, but about faith, eternity, and God. I didn't grow up confused about belief. My world was clear, structured, devout. I was raised in Mosul, Iraq, in a home where the voice of the Quran was as constant as the air we breathed. My grandfather, Sheikh Marwan, was a revered imam, and from the time I was a little boy, he poured his life into teaching me how to recite the Quran with flawless tajweed. I would sit beside him for hours on the cold rug in his study, my fingers tracing every line, my heart swelling with purpose. There was never a moment in my upbringing when I doubted who I was meant to be. I was to become a man of Allah, a servant of divine truth, a leader in prayer, a voice of tradition in a world that was changing too fast. By the time I was 28, I was standing where he once stood, leading a community of hundreds every Friday, guiding them with verses I had memorized since childhood. And I believed, without question, that I was on the straight path. But the world outside our faith didn't share our certainty. Political unrest gripped Iraq like a vice, and when my uncle was kidnapped and killed during a conflict between factions, I realized my family could no longer stay. My wife Hannah and I made the painful decision to flee with our 2 young daughters, Samira and Lena, and seek asylum in the United States. We settled in Dearborn, Michigan, where the Muslim community was thriving, and I quickly found a new role as an imam in a modest but growing masjid. At first, it felt like Allah had delivered us to safety. I continued my work with renewed conviction. I taught Quranic studies 5 nights a week, led weddings, funerals, and prayer gatherings, and became a father figure to many in our neighborhood. People came to me with questions, confessions, heartbreaks. I guided them. I comforted them. I reminded them of Allah's mercy and the paradise that awaited the faithful. To them, I was not just Yusuf. I was Sheikh Yusuf, a man of unwavering certainty, who walked without fear because he knew his destination was secure. That illusion shattered in early 2018 when I began to feel pain in my side that wouldn't go away. At first, I dismissed it as fatigue from fasting or the stress of overwork. But when I started losing weight and waking in the middle of the night with a burning ache in my abdomen, Hannah insisted I see a doctor. I still remember the sterile white walls of the clinic, the quiet tension in the air as the physician reviewed my scans. She looked at me with a softness I didn't yet understand and said, "Yusuf, I'm so sorry. It's stage 4 pancreatic cancer." I heard the words, but my mind refused to accept them. Stage 4. Terminal. Inoperable. These were not terms that belonged to me. I was a man of God. A man with purpose. Men like me didn't just vanish. That ride home felt like a funeral procession. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I just held the steering wheel like it might float me away from this nightmare. When I finally told Hannah, she collapsed into my chest and sobbed until she couldn't breathe. My daughters, too young to understand, just held my hands, asking why everyone was so sad. But I didn't crumble, at least not right away. I told myself this was a test. Allah had tested the prophets with worse. Job, peace be upon him, suffered disease and loss but never cursed his Lord. I would be the same. I would endure. I began chemotherapy, dragging my aching body into the hospital each week while whispering prayers under my breath. My congregation prayed for me. They brought food, sat with me, cried with me. My house became a revolving door of well-wishers and Quran reciters. Every day, I repeated the same words. This is Allah's will. If I die, it will be in submission. But behind those words, something small and unsettling had begun to form. A silence in my prayers. A numbness in my worship. I couldn't name it yet, but it was there, growing like a shadow. The day it happened started like any other sick day, though the pain was worse. I remember how Hannah helped me into bed after another brutal chemo session, how she tried to hide the worry in her face as she tucked the blanket around my legs and placed a bowl of soup on the nightstand. My body was so weak, I could barely lift the spoon. I tried to smile at her, to tell her not to worry, but the words caught in my throat. I laid back, closed my eyes, and prayed silently. Ya Allah, if this is my time, let it come quickly. Let me enter your mercy without fear. The room was dim. Outside, I could hear the wind rustling the trees. It was quiet, too quiet. That stillness, I would come to learn, was not peace. It was the calm before everything I knew was torn apart. It started with a tightness in my chest. Not like before. This wasn't just pain, it was pressure, suffocating and sharp, like my ribs were collapsing in on themselves. I tried to call for Hannah, but my mouth wouldn't move. My arms went limp. The room spun once, then again. My vision blurred into a smear of shadows and light. I felt a deep pull, like something was dragging me backward, down into the mattress, and then, I was out. Out of my body. Hovering just above the bed, watching my wife rush into the room, her screams slicing through the silence as she grabbed her phone with shaking hands. She was crying, yelling my name, slapping my face, trying to wake me. I saw the paramedics arrive, their faces tight with urgency. I saw them place paddles on my chest. I saw my lifeless body jerk violently. But I felt nothing. No fear. No pain. Just distance. Just stillness. And then, behind me, a light began to glow. At first, it was soft. Gentle. Like the warm light of dawn just before the sun breaks the horizon. It called to me, not with sound, but with feeling. I turned toward it, and instantly the hospital room faded. I was somewhere else. Somewhere quiet. Peaceful. I stood, not floated, stood, on solid ground, but I couldn't see the ground beneath my feet. The light grew brighter, surrounding me in a golden haze, and with it came sounds. Familiar sounds. My mother humming an old lullaby she used to sing when I was sick as a boy. The sound of rain falling on the tin roof of our old house in Mosul. The call to prayer echoing over rooftops at dawn. It was as if my entire life was being played back to me, not in pictures or memories, but through sound and feeling. I smiled. I wept. I whispered Alhamdulillah, and stepped forward. I truly believed I had arrived at paradise. But the peace didn't last. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the light began to dim. The warmth cooled. The sounds faded. In their place came a low hum, a vibration that grew louder, deeper, until it became a roar. I looked around, but the beauty had begun to rot. Trees I hadn't noticed before turned to ash. The golden haze turned to gray, then black. The air thickened with a smell I can only describe as death. Not decay. Not rot. But spiritual death, the scent of hopelessness, of something long dead and buried but still whispering in the dark. I turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. Screams erupted around me, agonizing, endless cries of men, women, and children. One voice rose above the rest, shrill and raw and unforgettable. Yusuf! It was my mother's voice. Mercy! Ya Allah, mercy! My heart shattered. I screamed her name, tried to find her, but I was frozen. Bound by fear, by confusion. And then, through the blackness, a figure appeared. A throne. Tall. Monolithic. Carved from something darker than stone. Upon it sat a figure, and as I drifted closer, my knees buckled. It was the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But he was not glorious. He was not radiant. He was bound. Shackled at the wrists. His head bowed. His eyes full of tears. I couldn't understand. This wasn't the man I had taught about, spoken of with such reverence. I called out to him, but he didn't answer. He only looked up, met my eyes, and wept. Behind him, shadowy forms twisted and writhed, their shapes unclear. Then, as if from the very air around me, a voice boomed, not loud, not angry, but final. Yusuf, everything you thought you knew will now be revealed. The voice echoed through everything, through the sky, through the ground, through my very bones. It didn't sound like thunder, but it struck like it. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a warning. It was a sentence. I stood there frozen, still watching the prophet on the throne, still reeling from the image of his sorrow. I kept thinking, this isn't how it's supposed to be. This isn't what I was taught. I had spent my life painting paradise with words. I had taught my students that Muhammad would intercede for us, that he would be honored above all prophets. But what I saw before me was not a man in glory. It was a man in grief. And something about his chains, the way they shimmered like smoke, the way they didn't weigh him down but still held him fast, made me understand, this wasn't his punishment. It was ours. He wept not for himself, but for what we had misunderstood. And then the ground cracked. From the darkness above something fell. It looked like a book, massive and ancient, but I recognized it immediately. The Quran. It landed with such force that it shook the very ground I stood on. The pages began to turn on their own, violently, like they were caught in a storm. And from those pages, visions poured out. I saw the Kaaba, centuries before Muhammad's time. Not clean, not pristine. It was surrounded by idols, offerings, chants. People bowed to statues named Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, Manat, and yes, Allah. The voice came again, steady and piercing. Before Islam, they called him Al-Ilah, the god above other gods. But he was one among many. My mouth went dry. I tried to protest, but the voice silenced me with a single word. Watch. I was pulled into another vision, this time in an ancient desert temple. There, people bowed before a large idol, flames burning at its feet. The name etched into the stone, Baal. And beneath it, in a script older than Arabic, another name appeared, El. Then came the voice again, not with accusation, but with challenge. Do you know who you worship? Or do you know only what you've been told? My head pounded. My heart ached. All I could think was, what is happening? Why am I seeing this? But somewhere deep inside, I already knew the answer. The faith I had built my life on, the certainty, the pride, the identity, was being peeled away like old skin. Not destroyed. Revealed. And then, the vision stopped. The book closed. Silence fell. I was back in the darkness, but it no longer felt like the absence of light. It felt like the presence of something watching, waiting. I dropped to my knees. I wept. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized how little I truly knew. I had spent decades answering questions, guiding others, speaking on behalf of heaven. But I had never once asked, who are you really? I had never once said, if I'm wrong, show me the truth. And in that moment, broken and trembling and stripped of everything I thought was sacred, I whispered those words. Whoever you are, show me the truth. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in that place of shadows and sorrow. I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines, the harsh buzz of monitors echoing in my ears. My chest felt like it had been caved in and rebuilt from the inside. My body ached in ways I didn't know were possible. There were nurses shouting, someone calling out my name, Hannah sobbing uncontrollably in the corner, her hands clutched in prayer. I had returned. But I knew, instantly, undeniably, that I had not come back the same man who had left. Something fundamental in me had shifted. The memories of that realm, of the prophet in chains, of the voice that stripped me bare, of the book that turned its own pages, were burned into my mind. I couldn't push them away, even when I wanted to. I couldn't make sense of them. And most terrifying of all, I couldn't unsee them. The days that followed were hollow. My body was alive, but my soul felt fractured. I tried to resume the routines that once gave my life structure, reading the Quran, performing the Salah, answering texts from congregants asking for prayers. But it all felt like pantomime. The words felt strange in my mouth. My voice faltered during recitation. The surahs I had known since I was a child now echoed in my ears like a language I hadn't fully mastered. Every moment of quiet brought the memory of the darkness. Every moment of stillness brought the sound of the voice. "Do you know who you worship?" I tried to confide in Hannah, but the words wouldn't come. "How do you tell the woman who's built a life with you, whose every prayer was made beside yours, that you're not sure anymore who you were praying to?" I began to read in secret. Not just the Quran, but history books, archaeological studies, ancient Semitic theology. I went to libraries far from my neighborhood, afraid of being recognized. I hid the titles beneath my jacket. I read about El, the supreme god of the Canaanites, and his merging with the high god of pre-Islamic Arabia, Al-Ilah, later known as Allah. I read how the name was not exclusive to Islam, how it had been used by Christians and pagans before Muhammad's time. And with every page, I felt something inside me unravel further. It was like discovering that the house you've lived in your entire life was built on sand. At first, I wanted to dismiss it, to rebuke it. But I couldn't. Not after what I had seen. Not after the voice. Then one day, I found myself back in the hospital, not as a patient, but as a man searching for silence. I wandered into the chapel. It was empty. No carpets. No minbar. Just rows of wooden pews, a simple cross on the wall, and a silence so deep it felt alive. I sat in the back, staring at the symbol of a faith I had spent my life refuting. And then a man sat down beside me. He didn't speak right away. Just sat there with me in the silence. After a while, he asked softly, "Do you want to talk about it?" I didn't know why, but I nodded. The words came rushing out. I told him everything. The light. The darkness. The prophet. The book. The voice. The fear. The questions. When I finished, I waited for judgment, for correction, for rebuttal. But he simply opened his Bible, placed it in my lap, and pointed to a verse. It read, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." I must have read that verse 100 times while sitting in that wooden pew. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The words didn't strike me like lightning, not at first. They didn't explode inside me like a miracle. Instead, they settled, slow, steady, heavy. Like a stone placed into the hands of a man who had been floating too long. Something to anchor me. Something real. The man sitting next to me introduced himself as Father Elijah, the hospital chaplain. He didn't try to preach. He didn't try to convert. He just said, "What you've seen. I believe it wasn't meant to scare you. I believe it was meant to wake you up." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. I had been sleeping for decades, confident, proud, blind. Over the next few weeks, I returned to the chapel more often than I did to the masjid. I still prayed, out of habit, out of obligation, but the words felt empty. I found myself reading the Bible in the quiet moments of the night. I started with John, then moved to Matthew. I read the parables of Jesus and felt something stir in me, something I hadn't felt in years. Not guilt, not fear, but hope. He didn't speak like the scholars I had studied under. He didn't sound like a prophet pleading for obedience or warning of wrath. He spoke of love, of truth, of a relationship with the Father, not through rituals, not through fear, but through Him. And that confused me. It frightened me. Because if this was real, then everything else I had believed might not be. I didn't tell Hannah. Not yet. I wasn't ready. But she knew something was wrong. She saw the way I stared out the window for hours, the way I avoided phone calls from the masjid, the way I jumped when the Quran app notification chimed from my phone. One night she asked me directly, "Yusuf, what's going on with you?" I told her I was tired, that the treatments were draining me. But that was a lie. The real war wasn't in my body, it was in my soul. I was beginning to see cracks in a foundation I had once believed was perfect. And I was terrified of where they might lead. I began to pull away from the community. I stopped leading prayers. I told the board at the masjid that my health was too unstable. They understood. But they didn't know the truth. I wasn't stepping away because I was dying. I was stepping away because something in me had already died. And then one night, everything came to a head. It was late. The girls were asleep. Hannah and I were in the kitchen. I was holding a cup of tea I hadn't touched. She stood at the sink, washing dishes. The silence between us stretched too long, and finally, she turned around and said, "You're slipping away from me, Yusuf." I looked up. Her eyes were glassy, but firm. "I know something's wrong," she said. "And I know it's not just the cancer." I felt something crack inside me. My hand trembled. I set the cup down, and I told her. I told her about the vision, about the prophet, about the throne, about the voice, about the Bible, about Jesus. I said his name out loud in our home for the first time in my life. Hannah didn't say a word for what felt like forever. She just stood there, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Her back was to me, but I could see her reflection in the kitchen window, her lips trembling, her eyes filling. When she finally turned around, her voice was low and shaky. "You saw the prophet? In chains?" I nodded. She shook her head, tears now rolling freely down her cheeks. "And you think Jesus is the answer?" The way she said his name, it was almost like a curse. Or maybe a question too painful to ask. "Yusuf," she whispered, stepping toward me. "You are my husband. The father of our daughters. The imam our community loves. What you're saying, it's blasphemy." I reached for her hand, but she pulled away like I'd burned her. "I don't know who you are right now," she said, backing out of the kitchen. "I need time." And with that, she disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone with my truth. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the Quran on the shelf and the Bible in my lap. I felt like I was standing between two burning buildings, one I had spent my life building, the other calling me with a whisper I couldn't ignore. For the first time since I was a child, I didn't know who I was. Not a husband. Not a father. Not an imam. Just a man, broken open by God. A man who had died and come back not to continue his old life, but to begin a new one. One he never asked for, but couldn't deny. The next few weeks were like walking through smoke. Hannah barely spoke to me. The girls sensed the tension but didn't know the cause. At the masjid, rumors began to circulate. Some said the cancer had affected my mind. Others said I had become bitter. I let them think what they wanted. I wasn't ready to share this part of my journey with anyone. Not yet. I wasn't even sure what to call it. I didn't feel like a Christian. I didn't feel like a Muslim. I felt like a man caught between two worlds, drawn toward a truth I couldn't explain. So I kept going to the chapel. I kept reading the Gospels. I met with Father Elijah when I could, not for conversion, but for conversation. And each time, I found myself drawn more and more to the man they called Jesus, not just for what he said, but for who he was. It wasn't a single verse or a single prayer that turned my heart. It was the slow realization that Jesus wasn't offering me another religion. He was offering me himself. Not a list of rules, not a set of rituals, but a relationship. He spoke with compassion to the sinner, with courage to the hypocrite, with love to the broken. He didn't come to control. He came to restore. And for a man who had spent his life trying to earn the favor of a distant, terrifying God, the idea of grace was unbearable and beautiful. I began to pray in secret, not to Allah, but to Jesus. I didn't have the right words. I just spoke from the mess inside me. If you are who you say you are, then show me. I don't want to be wrong again. It was a Sunday morning in late December when everything came to a head. I had spent most of the night in the chapel, as I often did now, sitting beneath the soft stained glass windows as the light of dawn crept through them. The Bible was open in my lap to the Gospel of Matthew, and I was rereading the Sermon on the Mount. I had read those words a dozen times already, but that morning, something in me cracked open for good. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. That was it. That was the line that undid me. Not the promise of power or reward. Not a call to obey out of fear. But a gentle truth, that those who seek God sincerely, who strip themselves of pride and posture, will find Him. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn heaven. I just wanted to know the one who made it. Later that day, I walked into Father Elijah's office and told him I couldn't wait any longer. I don't know how to be a Christian, I said, but I know I met the truth. And I know it wasn't who I thought it was. He didn't pressure me. He didn't celebrate. He just smiled quietly and said, Yusuf, you've already started. Saying yes to Him is the beginning. On December 23, 2018, I was baptized in a small side room of the hospital chapel. It was simple. Just me, Father Elijah, and the presence of God. As the water was poured over my head, I felt something wash over me that no prayer had ever given me, not peace like silence, but peace like power. A stillness that filled every broken place in me. I came out of that water not fixed, not perfect, but alive. I had died once in the flesh, and now, in spirit, I had risen again. Going home that day was harder than dying. Hannah met me at the door. I didn't have to say anything. She saw it in my eyes. You did it, she whispered. I nodded. She stood there for a long moment, then turned away. I need space, she said. I'm not ready for this. That was the last time we spoke for weeks. The girls kept their distance. I didn't push. I knew I had broken something sacred to them. Something that had once been sacred to me, too. But how do you explain to someone that the thing you broke needed to be broken? That only after it shattered did you see what was real? I gave them time, and I gave them prayer. Not the kind I once said on a rug facing Mecca, but the kind that rose from a heart on its knees, pleading with Jesus to heal the ones I still loved. Word of my baptism spread quickly. Some said I had lost my mind. Others said I had been seduced by Western lies. A few accused me of selling out for money or safety. I didn't defend myself. Not because I didn't care, but because no argument could explain what I had seen, what I had lived. This wasn't a decision made in debate. It was a truth etched into my soul with fire and mercy. The masjid removed me quietly from their leadership board. My name was no longer listed among the teachers. And yet, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't lost. I was found. I was free. Jesus hadn't just saved me from hell. He had saved me from a life built on fear, pride, and performance. And I would never go back. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and my body, once withered by cancer, began to heal in ways no doctor could explain. The pain subsided. The weight returned. The color came back to my skin. My oncologist, a quiet and methodical woman named Dr. Reynolds, stared at my latest skin with disbelief. I don't know how to tell you this, she said, blinking hard at the report, but there's no tumor. It's gone. She ordered more tests. Second opinions. Consultations. But the result was always the same, no trace of cancer. She called it a spontaneous regression. I called it what it was, a miracle. not because I deserved it, but because the one I now belonged to had given it freely. The same Jesus who met me in the darkness had reached into my dying flesh and brought me back again. I began to share my story quietly at first, one person at a time. Some listened with wide eyes, with tears, with hearts open. Others walked away mid-sentence. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The truth wasn't just something I believed now. It was someone I knew. I started attending a small local church, a community of people who had no idea what I used to be. They didn't care that I had once worn a white robe and led prayers in Arabic. They cared that I had met Jesus. They welcomed me, not as a project, but as a brother. And little by little, I found healing in their fellowship. The shame that once clung to me began to fall away. I began to laugh again. To sing. To raise my hands in worship, not out of duty, but out of joy. One Sunday morning, after service, I stepped outside and saw Hannah waiting in the parking lot. She was holding Lena's hand. Samira was standing beside her, taller now, looking uncertain but curious. I froze. We hadn't spoken in almost 3 months. She walked up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't agree with what you've done," she said. "I may never believe what you believe, but you're still their father, and they want to know you." My heart cracked. I nodded, fighting tears. "I'm still me," I said. "Just not the same me." She looked into my eyes for a long moment, then said, "No, you're not. But maybe that's not a bad thing." It was the beginning of something new. Not a full reconciliation, but the start of a road I hoped we'd walk together one day. Now I wake each morning with the kind of peace I once only dreamed about. Not a peace that comes from certainty in ritual or pride in tradition, but peace that flows from a relationship with the living God. I spend my days writing, mentoring young men who are where I once was, caught between identity and truth. I tell them what I wish someone had told me. Jesus is not a Western God. He's not a foreign prophet. He is the Son of God, the Savior of the world, yes, even ours. He is not afraid of your questions. He is not offended by your doubt. He's waiting for you in the silence, in the ache, in the moment you finally say, "I want to know the truth." So now, I say this to you. Whoever you are, wherever you are, if you've watched this far, maybe it's not an accident. Maybe this story found you because you've been asking questions no one else can answer. Maybe you're stuck in the same place I was, caught between fear and freedom. I don't have all the answers. But I can tell you this, Jesus is real. He met me when I died. He walked with me through darkness. He carried me out of hell. And He gave me a new name, a new heart, and a new life. If He did that for me, He can do it for you too. If this story moved you, please don't keep it to yourself. Like, comment, and share it with someone who needs hope. And if you're searching for answers, I challenge you, pick up a Bible. Start in the book of John. Read it not with fear, but with curiosity. And if you feel something stir inside you, follow it. That's Him. He's calling. Will you answer?